It's challenging to cover this topic in 15 minutes. We're living in the midst of this right now, and just when you think there can't be any more bad news, we keep hearing about these incidents happening again and again. And of course, many of us are feeling this collective trauma, but it is the specifically anti-Black racism that we need to address if we are going to have a complete analysis of police brutality. And even though thanks to smartphones and social media, we're all aware of how these recent killings by the police have led to a nationwide racial uprising, it is always important to remember that this anti-Black violence, which is state-sanctioned, is at the very foundation of our nation's history and institutions. This is why I thought it was really important to assign the lecture that we have in the module that looks at the history of policing in the United States, and that gives you a comprehensive understanding of how this started with slave patrols, and it helps you understand what is happening today. So this is not new, unfortunately. This is the normal for Black folks in our nation. It's just that some of us are coming to this awareness or awakening to this reality. And so the assertion we're making in our class is that law enforcement institutions are inherently racist in our country. And you can see that throughout our history, the police have been used to create and protect white wealth, and have often targeted Black people, immigrants, and minorities, and poor people. Slave patrols evolved into modern police departments. And this is why, again, it's important to hear the historian's perspective on this. Often these are parts of history that we leave out, again, in our K through 12 education, and sometimes even in our college and university education. And so if you break it down into these four eras of slavery, pre-civil rights, Jim Crow, as well as in our current situation, you'll find that throughout, white and wealthy portions of our population are accustomed to having a state-sanctioned force to maintain status quo, right? So slave patrols existed in the South precisely to protect wealthy white landowners, literally their property that was human beings. And then after the Civil War, with the abolition of slavery, we see that sheriffs then took on this role of enforcing segregation, or as vigilante groups like the Ku Klux Klan became more active, they often became active with the help of the police force. There were many KKK members in our police force, in our politics. In the North, the police were used to control immigrant workers and block labor strikes. You'll see that mentioned in the lecture as well. And throughout, this is premised on the stereotype of Black and increasingly brown men as predators. You have the image of the infamous movie Birth of a Nation, where you see the KKK hailed as heroes, as defenders of white women's honor and dignity. And you have these white actors in blackface. You see this person here who is in blackface, right? Being lynched by the KKK because they were about to rape white women. And this was a devastating image. It led to real life consequences, right? In terms of lynchings and terrorism against black folks and black men. And this is why this recent incident is even more jarring with Amy Cooper, right? Calling the cops on the African American bird watcher. Because in that moment, she knew exactly what she was doing, right? Weaponizing, right? The potential of what might as well have been the 19th century cry, a fake false cry for rape, right? And we know the consequences of that, right? That it often ends with the loss of life for black men and sometimes even black children, if you think back to Emmett Till's incident. So as we look at police brutality and how it's perpetuated with often internalized stereotypes, but also institutionalized practices within the law enforcement, we want to also think about how the public accepts some of this, right? Because the dominant framework has been to see black and brown men as predators. And these are dangerous people who need to either be eliminated or certainly locked up. If you look at during the civil rights movement, I think again it's ironic that you look at current protests and so on, people are exercising their First Amendment rights to assemble. 95% of BLM protests have been peaceful. Because once you deem them riots, then you can have all kinds of state-sanctioned violence against on these groups of folks who are exercising their constitutionally guaranteed rights. And this story, again, unfortunately, is not new. We like to create this myth of the civil rights movement as this peaceful movement where this image actually captures it perfectly, right on the right side, where they have Dr. King, and it says, never burned one building, never robbed one store, never destroyed one town, right? This is a myth. This is a myth we have created, and in our class, hopefully, you want to examine the functions of that myth. It says at the bottom, change the world, without ever engaging in any of that. Now, of course, Dr. King preached nonviolence, but nonviolence was anything but civil, right? Nonviolence that he practiced was all about breaking the law, which is why he was arrested several times, right? And in fact, important to remember, in 1968, the perception of Dr. King was very different. And most Americans gave him a very unfavorable rating, right? In fact, on the left side, you see how he was depicted by the media of the time. This is how MLK was seen in 1967. In the cartoon, it says, I plan to lead another non-violent march tomorrow. As this kind of like, look at all this destruction he's causing, and he's just a hypocrite, right? So it's really important, again, to differentiate between this myth and reality. And it was horribly violent, violence against the protesters, right? Where the police responded like they're doing now, with tear gas, high pressure hoses, in that era with attack dogs, right? Then in the current situation, you see this amplified minority communities after 9/11. You add phobia and the anti-Muslim sentiment as well. New York City has implemented stop and frisk policies, which their own data reveal as being ineffective. They hardly ever lead to arrests. This is just plain profiling and harassment, which is unconstitutional, by the way. And so, because of this excessive police presence, young Black and Latino men are profiled, and that explains mass incarceration of these groups, which is the topic we will cover in our next module. So, if you look for historical evidence, you find that the American police was never designed as a deterrent to crime, but rather a symbol of white supremacy. Right? And so this argument that it's just a matter of a few racist cops, few bad apples, is really bogus. If you look for historical and empirical evidence, you find that this is institutionalized, right? Since the beginning, the police have always enforced the law, regardless of how racist those laws were, right? And that's why you'll find that Ta-Nehisi Coates, in one of the readings I assigned, is pushing back against this idea of reform, right? Where he's saying that the police cannot be expected to police themselves or improve themselves, right? Because there's very little accountability and consequences that we have currently. I also assigned to you Between the World and Me just because I do believe that he's one of those writers who can be very influential even with the younger generation. He has been called the champion of our times. And it's a complex piece in the letter that he's writing to his young son, right? Revealing in kind of showing what Black parents go through, especially if you have a young son who is pre-adolescent or adolescent. I can only imagine the terror. In fact, one of the additional sources is this video of Black parents talking to their children, having the talk, right? Of how do you behave when a police officer approaches you. And it's a life and death situation each time. So you can imagine the collective trauma of that, trauma that builds up each time. And he says, Black people love their children with a kind of obsession. You are all we have, and you come to us endangered. I think we would like to kill you ourselves before seeing you killed by the streets that America made. That is a philosophy of the disembodied, of a people who control nothing, who can protect nothing. And that I feel is like really heartbreaking for me as a parent, right? How do you teach your kid to be assertive, confident, proud, and at the same time make sure that they're alive, right? So this becomes very real for folks who have Black children. Now, many portions of the essay also look at this impact of internalized racism. Internalized racism is a concept we will look at again in our class. And it's about creating new measuring sticks that he's talking about for his son, right? I don't want you to be twice as good, but create your own measuring stick, is what he's saying. And he's also saying that there was nothing holy or particular in my skin. I was Black because of history and heritage, reinforcing this idea that race and racial identity is socially historically constructed, right? But we have a tendency to look at Black history from a deficit perspective, right? Or go to the other extreme of Afro-nationalism, right? Which Ta-Nehisi Coates is critiquing in his essay. In this final slide, I wanted to point out the links between the Black Panther movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And acknowledge the contributions of activists of the past who have always called out brutality and fought against it. Includes Ida B. Wells, Stokely Carmichael, Hugh Newton, all of these men and women of color who have bravely spoken the truth, right, about US law enforcement. Okay, and you will be reading Angela Davis's essay for our next module as well.